Good evening. My name is Ligia Bolívar. I'm a researcher at the Human Rights Center at Católica University in Caracas. I would like to start my presentation by insisting on characterizing the situation. The flow of people from Venezuela have been described as exodus, diaspora, avalanche, massive departure, among others. These qualifications serve to describe the massive dimension of the phenomenon. However, it doesn't help to appreciate what is behind it. And what is behind it is right holders with international protection needs. So far, governments have been careful to qualify people from Venezuela, considering them in a situation of human mobility, avoiding any reference to their status as a subject of rights, precisely. Venezuelans are not voluntary migrants, and that's the important point I want to make and to remind. They should be considered as holders of rights, specifically designed to protect their condition as people in need of international protection. The way in which public policies in governments and international agencies are designed respond very much to the kind of concept that is behind to describe the Venezuelan population. And that is one of the concerns that we have in this situation now. The second point I want to make is the relationship between migration and political economic crisis in Venezuela. The peaks in the flow of people from Venezuela has been linked with political or economic events in the country and changes in the migration policies of some recipient countries. In this way, it is possible to identify significant increments that coincide with different events. For example, in October 2016, there was the suspension of the recall of referendum, and that was the first big peak that we had of people leaving the country. Then, in July 30, 2017, we have the Constituent Assembly voting event, and there was another peak. And a third peak was in May 2018 with the presidential voting event. And I stress there were voting events, there was not elections as such in the way we consider a democratic process in democratic countries. Another peak was in August 2018 with the economic announcement and monetary reconversion in the country. I hope we can share with you a graphic when you can see these peaks, and you will see how the flow of people are related to the dates that I just mentioned. So it is possible to predict that the expected political turmoil in this year, added to the accelerated deterioration of wages as a result of hyperinflation and the collapse of services as electricity and water, will present a new and significant increase in the number of people who leave Venezuela in a forced way. The international response to this Venezuelan crisis, with the exception of the international human rights protection bodies such as UNHCR, of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the international level, and the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights at the regional level. Besides, with this exception, the rest of the international reaction has been slow, has been dispersed, with a limited approach to protection. In March last year, as probably many of you know, UNHCR set an important milestone by publishing a guidance note on the flow of Venezuelans. The note encouraged states to apply the regional concept, the regional refugee definition contained in the Cartagena Declaration. This expanded definition of refugee contained in the declaration says, and I quote, "The definition or concept of a refugee recommended for use in the region is one that, in addition to containing the elements of the 1951 Convention and the Protocol of 1967, also consider as refugees people who have fled their countries because their life, security, or freedom has been threatened by widespread violence, foreign aggression, internal conflict, massive violation of human rights, or other circumstances that have seriously disturbed public order." That's the quote. So the UNHCR is recognizing the existence in Venezuela of massive violation of human rights and of circumstances that have disturbed public order in the country, which make it necessary to consider its citizens as holders of special protection measures. It doesn't matter when they left, but the risk faced if they return. Meaning by that, for example, in the case of Canada, that you have many people that probably left many years ago, or few years ago, when the situation in Venezuela was not as serious as it is now. But the fact that there is a fear or there is a risk at the time of their return made them subject of international protection according to the Cartagena concept. So this is particularly relevant in the case of Canada, even if Canada is not part of the signatories of the Cartagena Declaration. In line with the guidance note, the UNHCR called for $46 million to meet the international protection needs of people from Venezuela during last year, 2018. The international response was very discouraging since until August of last year, only 24.9 million, almost 25 million were collected, and that was equivalent to 54% of what it was expected. For this year, until February, only 7% of the required amount, which is higher than the one that was required last year, has been collected. Repeating, as I was saying before, the slow and poor response of states to deal with this crisis. In the case of the Inter-American system, it is necessary also to mention the joint declaration for the development of it's called Joint Declaration for the Development of a Regional Response to the Massive Arrival of Venezuelan People in Countries of the Americas of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and Special Committees, Bodies and Procedures of the Organization of the United Nations, And that was approved on September last year. In addition of being a very valuable initiative that involved the participation of 5 regional and international bodies, the text recommends a set of measures from a vision and protection approach and the long term, which is also very important. It's on the same day of this publication, the declaration was presented by the Inter-American Commission before a meeting of the Permanent Council of the OAS, convened precisely to deal with the situation of the migratory crisis caused by the situation in Venezuela. And in this meeting, the Secretary General of the OAS announced the creation of a working group on this migrant crisis situation in Venezuela to analyze the migration issue and to produce responses to it from from a human rights approach. The purpose of this working group, and I quote here again, is to produce a report that evaluates the full scale of the crisis of Venezuelan migrants and refugees in the region, and to initiate the implementation of actions to mobilize resources to address this crisis. And this working group, was headed by the Venezuelan political leader in exile, David Smolansky. However, the announcement of the creation of these working groups by the OAS was taken with very little enthusiasm by civil society organizations, since it is in charge of a citizen of the country concerned, in this case Venezuela, and with no proven experience in managing the situation of people in need of international protection, which could make more difficult to implement the mandate approved by the Secretary General. And that's probably why later on in October last year, the Secretary General of the OAS announced the incorporation of 5 experts on migration and refugee issues from various countries in the region to this working group. However, 6 months after its creation, the working group released a preliminary report, not a final one, only a preliminary report on March this year. And it's very worrying that given the speed of evolution and the volume of increase in the Venezuelan human mobility crisis, the working group took 6 months only to produce a preliminary report, and that this report doesn't fulfill the mandate given to the group, since it is, as I say, is identified as a preliminary report by the authors. There is also concern that the presentation has been made to the media, not to the Permanent Council, which reduce opportunity for advocacy against those who have the power to make decisions that contribute to ensure a lasting solution, and with a protection focus on the people from Venezuela. The expert members of the working group were not consulted or incorporated in the preparation of the preliminary report, and this is a very serious issue. In addition, the field work was limited to only visit of two departments in Colombia, and that probably explains the scarce novelty of information in this document, the absence of protection approach, the emphasis on political and economic information of the country instead of more information on the situation of the human mobility, and an inappropriate comparison with other situations of people in need in regions, in other regions of the world. The preliminary report doesn't have any recommendation to states, to the multilateral agencies. Of course, nothing to no recommendation to member states of the OAS. So it is a missed opportunity. One aspect that I would like to stress is that while it is true that recipient countries are facing an unprecedented situation that goes beyond their capabilities, it is difficult to sustain the request for international cooperation if they persist in a migrant approach, in contrast to the forced migration and refugee situation to qualify and treat people from Venezuela. Voluntary migration is something to which each country can agree on regulations, set limits, and make decisions about who to admit or not. For this, international cooperation is not essential because the country is not obliged to accept voluntary migrants indefinitely in their countries. However, international cooperation is essential when a receiving or transit country face a critical situation that, for humanitarian reasons, cannot and should not restrict or hinder. While the receiving or transit countries do not assume an international human rights protection approach, international cooperation cannot be seen as an obligation. So the point I'm trying to make here is that unless countries, recipient countries and transit countries understand that they are facing a situation involving people in need of international protection, there is no way, there is no reason why there should be international cooperation, because international cooperation for regular migration is not a priority at the international level. However, it is a priority to focus on the protection of people in need of these international standards. And I hope that we hope that the international cooperation agencies also encourage countries, recipient countries, to take measures to understand and to accept that the population that they are receiving from Venezuela, they are not ordinary migrants, voluntary migrants, but people that need this international protection. Example of the different approach when you deal with migrants, voluntary migrants, and when you deal with involuntary or forced migration or refugees, is the way you treat them in terms of the kind of requirements that they have to fulfill. In general, the state's response to people from Venezuela has been characterized by the absence of durable solutions, the increase of restrictions, and the lack of a protection approach from the perspective of human rights. We can see, for example, the temporary measures taken by countries like Peru and Colombia, which are the countries that are receiving the bigger number of migrants and refugee seekers. But again, I mean, the situation is that they are taking temporary measures. They have these temporary cards, and as the word says, it's temporary. It's not a permanent solution. So that's one problem. And the other problem is the increase of restrictions for entry, and that is happening again in Peru, Colombia, but also in Chile, Ecuador, Panama, Honduras, Guatemala. And this increase of restrictions is very much related also to documents. And I want to quote here something mentioned by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in the case of Ecuador, but they also extend to other countries. And I quote, the Inter-American Commission warned that the many difficulties and obstacles that Venezuelan people face in obtaining or renewing their passports, as well as for the issues of other documents such as identity cards, birth certificates, live birth certificates, criminal record certificates, or the documents apostille process, the Inter-American Commission has received information indicating that the Venezuelan people face multiple difficulties in processing or renewing these documents as a result of the lack of materials for their preparation, the high cost that might be associated with the processing, and the long deadlines for the appointment or processing and delivery of these documents. End of quote. So the Inter-American system, the Inter-American Commission is very clear about the kind of difficulties, and there are many countries that are not taking enough putting enough attention to this. In fact, as far as Canada is concerned, there are cases of Venezuelans who were in regular condition as residents in the country, and when their passport expired, sometimes for more than 2 years, the immigration authorities did not renew their passport, did not renew their residence, and in consequence, they have lost employment and or housing, and from being taxpayers and self-sufficient, they have become, or they are becoming a burden to the state. So it is important that the recipient countries understand the situation of Venezuela, to understand that these are not regular voluntary migrants, and therefore countries cannot require the same documents that you would require to regular voluntary migrants. It is absurd, for example, to imagine people fleeing, going from Syria to Europe to pretend that they have passports. They don't have passports because the country is collapsed, and because many of them just simply leave the country to save their lives. That is the situation that we're facing now in Venezuela. You cannot expect people to have documents to arrive into the country. In addition to this, you have, for example, after 1 year after the first Quito Declaration, there was a voluntary agreement from states that attended that meeting in September last year, and in that declaration, the countries agreed to accept expired travel documents as an identity documents of Venezuelan citizens for migration purposes. However, less than half of the countries have implemented this agreement. So far, only Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Paraguay, and Chile have decided to accept expired documents. So we need and we hope that the rest of the countries in the region, and also Canada, start accepting this agreement that was taken a year ago. As for the Lima Group, it has been an oscillating position on the issue of migrants and refugees from Venezuela. In the first 3 statements of 2017, there was no reference to the phenomenon of human mobility. Only 2 statements mentioned the issue. I think it was in May 2018 and January 2019. So there is very little reference to the issue of migrants and refugees in the Lima Group, and these are the countries who are receiving people from Venezuela. I would like to conclude stressing that people who leave Venezuela do not do it voluntarily. There is enough information to characterize this population as forced migrants and refugees based on the reason they express as motivating their departure. And the human mobility crisis in Venezuela continues to receive insufficient attention from the receiving countries, which persists in treating people from Venezuela as voluntary migrants, subjecting them to various bureaucratic obstacles and requirements that do not correspond to their condition of people in need of international protection, especially in the area of documentation, as I already mentioned. This insufficient and delayed response also affect the fundraising campaigns of bodies such as the UNHCR, and this suggests that donors seem to be given priority to direct cooperation with the states and recipient countries, rather than channeling funds through agencies that, precisely because of their international and intersectorial nature of their work and their experience, would be better able to provide articulate and comprehensive responses to this crisis. And I just want to finish thanking the Center for Human Rights at the University of Ottawa, the Canada-Venezuela Democracy Forum, UNHCR, and the Parliamentary Center for providing this space. I regret not being ready to share the debate, and I wish you a very fruitful reflection. Thank you.